Hello again, everyone. It's Adam. Welcome to episode 9 of the Sects. So, this video is going to cover the various sects or groups of vampires that exist in the world of darkness. First, I'm going to start with the first sect that most players will be introduced to, which is the Camarilla. The Camarilla is a group of 7 recognized clans that organized together after the Anarch revolt in the 15th century to come together under certain rules and guidelines. The best way I can sum up the Camarilla is modern feudalism. This is the sect that has every city that it controls is ruled over by a prince, a single vampire who's basically god unto their domain. The Camarilla follows what's called the traditions. These are the laws that the vampires of the Camarilla have to follow. And so the major clans of the Camarilla are going to be the Toreador, the Gangrel, the Ventru, Malkavian, Bruja, Tremere, and Nosferatu clans. Assamites are also a common member of the clan, this Camarilla as well. So the traditions of the Camarilla, these are the 6 rules that the Camarilla follows. The first is the masquerade. That is that mortals can never learn that vampires exist, that you must hide yourself from mortals. This one, if you violate in a Camarilla domain, you're going to die pretty quick. It's a big one. It's a big no-no. Obviously, if mortals find out vampires exist, they'll probably turn on them and try to kill all of the vampires like they did during the Dark Ages. Second tradition is domain. Domain is the area a vampire controls. So the city itself, its domain is controlled by the prince, and the prince can decide who can feed and live where. This would be individual domain. And if you try to take another vampire's domain or aren't given that domain by the prince, you can get in trouble for it. The next tradition, the third tradition, is progeny. Progeny is their right to create another vampire. If you do not get permission from the prince to create a vampire, you can get in trouble for that. The fourth tradition is the accounting. That is, if you make a child, another vampire, you are responsible for them and their actions until they're released and recognized in Camarilla society as their own individual. So if your child does something bad, it's on you to pay for that. The fifth tradition is hospitality. This is the right of the prince to grant you into his city, to stay there, to become part of the court. If you don't have hospitality, you can be hunted by what's called the Scourge. It's a vampire appointed to hunt people in a prince's city that don't have hospitality. And the sixth tradition is destruction. You do not have the right to kill another vampire unless the prince says so. And so within a Camarilla city, they have, obviously, as I spoke before, the prince is the one vampire that rules over the city. Beneath them, him or her, is the Primogen Council. These are one vampire for each of the Camarilla clans, appointed to rule as a council, advise the prince. They have some ability to affect his decisions, but not a lot if the prince is powerful enough. If the Primogen Council is powerful enough, they can override the prince. So there's a back and forth there in the politics and gaining favor of the Primogen Council and the prince. You also have the Seneschal, second in command basically to the prince, that when the prince isn't available, the Seneschal is in charge. You have the sheriff, whose job is to enforce the traditions and the will of the prince on the city. You have the harpy, whose job it is to keep up on the social know-how and record what's called boons. Boons are favors owed between Camarilla vampires. So the main focus of Camarilla is social conflict and intrigue, to get one up over another clan for your clan or for your coterie. A coterie is a group of Camarilla vampires that come together for a specific purpose and goal. And boons are what's traded as a currency. And there are various levels of boons that you can trade for goods and services. If another vampire saves your life, you owe them a life boon, which means they basically own your life. There's minor and major boons, favors owed, and this is the economy that's traded. Also, your standing in the Camarilla, what your reputation is, who backs your name, often determines who's right and wrong in a situation. A person with very high status, his word is going to be taken over someone that is very low. Like I said, Camarilla is very modern feudalism. Above On a city level, on a grand level of across the world in the Camarilla, you have the Justicars, who are appointed by the leaders of the Camarilla, one for each clan, to kind of police and oversee Camarilla domains. Camarilla has conclaves every once in a while where the sect gets together to discuss important topics and make decisions. There's a lot of gatherings and balls and social politicking as kind of the driving force of what the Camarilla is. Now, mind you, I do want to reiterate, the Camarilla are not good guys. There are no good guys in Vampire. You're all playing monsters that have a beast. Camarilla vampires, like I had mentioned earlier under the Blood Bond section, will often punish another vampire by making drink their blood and enslave them. They also manipulate and play with mortals' lives for either their own entertainment or power. They can be very corrupt and oppressive. The Camarilla focuses a lot on age and prestige. The older you are as a vampire, the more respect you get. So imagine a corporate environment where your boss is literally never going to retire because they're immortal, and so you can't move up the rung. And that's kind of the Camarilla in and of a nutshell. After the Camarilla, you have the other major sect, which is the Sabbat. The Sabbat is in many ways, the opposite of the Camarilla, and will often be said to be the bad guy sect. They're not the bad guy sect. There is no good or bad. There's just a lot of gray. The Sabbat is a theocracy, is best to describe that. It is a group of vampires from a variety of beliefs and ideals as to what the Sabbat is and should be. But ultimately, the Sabbat doesn't follow the Camarilla traditions. They do recognize what they call the silence of the blood out of a necessity to survive, that if mortals find out they would be destroyed, but it's not in the same way. They would much rather kill a human who has discovered that they have existed than, say, wipe their memory that vampires exist. Sabbat vampires embrace the fact that they are vampires, and Camarilla vampires try to hide among the mortals. Among the Sabbat, they do have their own code that they follow instead of the traditions, called the Code of Milan. It was created after a couple civil wars within the sect itself, which outlines the purpose and duties of the Sabbat. They are a sect that promotes freedom above all else, but also has a hierarchy you have to listen to. It's very contradictory. The Sabbat has its own dark rituals and blood-type sorcery that they use to enforce this. All Sabbat engage in what's called the Valdery, which is a ritual mixing of blood that binds a group of vampires together, generally into what's called a pack, whereas the Camarilla has the coterie. The Sabbat has a pack. Among the pack, you will have the Doctus, who is the leader, the pack priest, who oversees the rituals, and the abbot, who kind of takes care of the haven and feeding needs of the pack. Packs in general can range from for a minimum of 3 members to all the way up to 10 to 15, though those are really, really big packs and pretty rare. The Sabbat don't really engage officially in boons. They have favor trading. They just don't label them or catalog it. They do have ritual combat to the death if it gets to that point between 2 vampires and they need to resolve an issue. Among the leadership of the sect, the closest equivalent to the prince you have is an archbishop who oversees the city. In the case where there isn't an archbishop, there can be, or even when there is an archbishop, there can be bishops. These are individuals that are just below the rank of archbishop. Generally, when there isn't an archbishop in a city, a council of bishops will help rule over a city, but some cities have an archbishop and a council of bishops. Archbishops appoint bishops. Each among the archbishops and bishops can have things called Templars. Templars are bodyguards, assassins, and things like that, and they can appoint as many of those as they need. Advising the archbishops and bishops are what's called Priscus. These are elder Sabbat vampires that act as advisors, similar in many ways to the Parisian Council, but there tends to be less of them in a city. Above all of that is a cardinal, which is kind of equivalent to a justicar in the Camarilla. They oversee vast swaths of Sabbat territory, and they also sit what's called the consistory, the governing body of the Sabbat itself that makes all the policies and decisions. And ultimately, the consistory appoints and is responsible to what's called the regent, the one vampire that is appointed to oversee all of the Sabbat. So the Sabbat are the vampires that tend to follow paths of enlightenment, embrace that they are vampires, and don't shy away from that, comparatively to the Camarilla, which is much more embracing of hiding among mortals at all costs. And those are the two major sects. And for many, many centuries, they were at active open war with each other. Now they have a bit more of a Cold War, though fights still do happen between the two of them, as they are very ideologically opposed to one another. Besides the two major sects, you have the Anarchs. They are nominally considered by the Camarilla to be part of them, though the Anarchs don't consider themselves part of them. It's nebulous as to who's right on that. The Anarchs are vampires that believe in freedom above all else and to break the oppression of both the Camarilla and the Sabbat, to support thin bloods, caitiff, young vampires in positions of power and authority, much more like a modern democracy. They're inspired by anarchy and socialism and modern concepts compared to the more ancient concepts of the Camarilla and the Sabbat. They don't really have a prince. They generally have an appointed leader known as a baron. They operate, instead of coteries or packs, as in gangs. These are groups of anarch vampires. Tend to reside in Camarilla territory, though they can reside in Sabbat and sometimes even have their own territory. After that, you have the independent clans, which are the Ravnos, the Giovanni, the Assamites, and the followers of Set. Each one of those is an island unto themselves that have their own culture and beliefs and structures. They each can work with the three major sects of the Camarilla, the Sabbat, and the Anarchs. The Sabbat tend to not really like the followers of Set because they openly worship the Antediluvians, and the Sabbat very much seek to stop Gehenna and the rise of the Antediluvians, so they're pretty much opposed to anyone that wants to do that. Same kind of deal with the Assamites, though less aggressive. The Giovanni they have dealings with, but technically the independents can work with anyone and are neutral in any conflict with the sects themselves. And then lastly, you kind of have the minor sects that are specific to a region. First, you have the Jati. These are the vampires of India, have organized themselves into their own sect, kind of inspired by the old caste system that India used to use, brought over into a vampire twist. You have the Ashra, which are the Middle East vampire sect. They are fundamentally based on Islam to a degree, again with a fictional vampiric twist to it. It's not exactly the same. You don't have to be Muslim to be part of the Ashra, actually. They just tend to follow a very twisted version of it. And then lastly, you have the Liban, which are the sect and vampires of Africa that are very different from all the others. The major clans don't even exist in the Liban. They have their own thing called legacies, which are proto-clans, old clans, nobody really knows. But they have their own structure and culture as well. The most common ones you're going to run into are obviously the Camarilla, the Sabbat, the Anarchs, and the Independents. Your character, you'll need to choose which sect your character is at character creation. If you're playing a Camarilla game, you're probably playing a Camarilla vampire. If you're playing a Sabbat game, you're going to play a Sabbat vampire. So make sure to check with your storyteller what type of game they're running and then choose the sect appropriate to that. Now, if at some point during gameplay your character decides to change sects, that is going to be coordinator approval. It's going to be a couple of coordinator approvals. So work with your storyteller on that. It's changing sects is not a common thing. It can happen, unlike clan, which pretty much never, ever changes. Barring some really weird story stuff and council votes, your clan won't change. But your sect theoretically can. It is just not an easy thing. Yeah. So that about covers the sects of Vampire the Masquerade. I hope that was helpful. There's a lot more videos out there on YouTube that go into much more detail and history on the sects. I definitely recommend checking those out besides the books themselves, if that's not really your thing. So that about wrap up this episode. Next episode is going to be episode 10, The Clans. Bye.